Have you ever noticed how the kindest people in the room are often the first to disappear from it? Not physically. They're still there, smiling, listening, absorbing the pain of everyone around them, but something inside them slowly dims. A light that once burned so bright it could illuminate entire rooms begins to flicker, and then one day, without warning, it goes out completely. This is the story of the empath who breaks, not because they're weak, but because they're strong in a way that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. Carl Jung, one of the most profound minds of the 20th century, documented cases that should have changed how we think about empathy forever. Yet most of us have never heard of them. One case in particular haunted Jung for years. It was the case of a woman who gave everything to everyone until the day she had nothing left to give. And when that day came, something shifted inside her that could never quite be put back together. The story doesn't begin with her crisis. It begins with a gift she didn't know she had. Empaths are often told they're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But what if the opposite is true? What if sensitivity isn't a weakness but a form of perception that others simply cannot access? What if empaths are essentially reading a frequency of human experience that ordinary people cannot hear? Think about the last time you walked into a room and immediately felt uncomfortable, even though no one had said anything wrong. You picked up on something, an undertone, a shadow beneath the surface. That intuitive knowing is what Jung called the unconscious transmission of affect. It's real, it's measurable, and for empaths it's exhausting. Here's where Jung's case becomes terrifying. The woman he observed wasn't just sensitive to emotions. She was what he termed a psychological medium, someone whose unconscious mind had become so attuned to others that she could absorb their emotional states as if they were her own. She didn't just feel other people's pain. She inhabited it. She lived inside it, and there was no switch to turn it off. For years she functioned. She was the person everyone came to, the one who understood, the one who held space, the one who never complained because she was too busy carrying everyone else's complaints. Her empathy became her identity, and identity, Jung discovered, can become a prison. Then something happened that would change everything. The turning point came when she realized the truth that no empath wants to acknowledge. Nobody was doing this for her. While she spent her emotional resources on others, while she translated their pain into understanding and compassion, nobody was there translating hers. She had become a translator who no longer understood her own language. This realization doesn't come gently. It doesn't arrive as a quiet thought. It arrives as a crack in the foundation. And then another, and then another, until one day the entire structure comes down. Jung called this moment the breakdown of the persona. The persona, he explained, is the mask we wear. It's how we present ourselves to the world. For empaths, the persona is often constructed from a false premise, that their worth comes from how much they can endure, that love means self-dissolution, that boundaries are selfish. But what happens when the persona breaks? Something primal emerges. Something that has been waiting behind the mask, compressed and furious. This isn't a gradual transformation. This is an explosion, and it's not beautiful. It's not the kind of transformation that gets celebrated in self-help books. It's raw. It's often cruel, and it feels like betrayal to everyone watching it happen. The woman in Jung's case didn't just set boundaries. She didn't become healthily assertive. She became, for a time, nearly unrecognizable. The empath who had spent decades absorbing others' needs suddenly had no capacity for anyone's needs but her own. And the people who had benefited from her endless compassion suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of something cold and cutting. This is the terrifying part that Jung understood but most therapists avoid mentioning. The empath who breaks doesn't just recover and become balanced. There's a period where they become almost the opposite of what they were. It's as if all the repressed anger, all the unspoken resentment, all the tiny deaths of self that accumulate over years suddenly demand to be felt and expressed at full volume. And here's the psychological insight that changes everything. This isn't a failure of the empath. This is the psyche's way of correcting an imbalance so severe it was threatening the integrity of the entire self. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the shadow. The shadow is the part of ourselves that society tells us is unacceptable. For empaths, the shadow is enormous. It contains every moment they chose understanding over honesty, every time they prioritize someone else's comfort over their own survival, every occasion they said yes when they meant no. The shadow grows with every suppressed boundary, and eventually it becomes so large, so desperate to be acknowledged, that it breaks through the careful construction of the persona. This is what happened to the woman Jung observed. Her shadow didn't emerge gradually. It erupted. But Jung discovered something even more important. On the other side of that eruption, something different could occur. Not a return to the old self. Not even the emergence of a new self. But the integration of both the light and the dark into something that could actually function. The problem with most empaths is that they never learn this. They break, and then they're ashamed of the breaking. They're told they're being selfish or toxic or unstable, so they put the persona back together. They apologize. They make themselves small again. They return to the role of psychological medium, of emotional translator for everyone but themselves. And the cycle begins again. But what if breaking could mean something different? What if the day the empath snaps could be the day they finally start to heal? To understand this more deeply, we need to look at something Jung called the anima and animus, the masculine and feminine aspects within all of us. Empaths, Jung noted, often have an overdeveloped receptive, nurturing aspect and a severely underdeveloped assertive, protective aspect. They can receive. They cannot refuse. They can give. They cannot preserve. This imbalance isn't spiritual enlightenment. It's psychological distortion. The empath who breaks is often the one who is finally integrating their inner masculine energy. The capacity to say no, the ability to protect themselves, the willingness to take up space. This isn't cold, this isn't selfish, this is wholeness, but it's scary to watch, because the world doesn't want empaths to be whole. The world wants empaths to be useful, and wholeness is the enemy of utility. A truly integrated empath is no longer an unlimited resource. They've learned that compassion has limits. That understanding doesn't require self-erasure. That love never means the dissolution of the self. Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this honestly. Are you an empath who is breaking, or an empath who hasn't broken yet? If you're breaking, you might be experiencing what feels like moral failure. You might feel like you're becoming someone you don't recognize. You might feel guilty for finally wanting something for yourself. You might feel ashamed of your anger, your coldness, your refusal to play the role you've always played. But what if this is actually your psyche's act of survival? What if breaking is the only path to becoming real? Here's the second principle that Jung emphasized, something he called the transcendent function. This is the psyche's innate ability to integrate opposite energies into something new. It's how humans evolve psychologically, but it only happens when the opposites are both fully present. When light exists alongside shadow. When compassion exists alongside boundaries. When receiving exists alongside refusal. Many empaths never activate their transcendent function because they never allow themselves to fully feel the opposite of what they've always felt. They suppress the anger. They minimize the resentment. They apologize for the coldness. And so they stay split, forever exhausted by the effort of holding down their own darker impulses. The empath who breaks and who stays broken long enough to understand what's happening can begin the real work. This is the work of integration, and this is where it gets real, because integration isn't comfortable. It isn't just about being nice, but with boundaries. It's about becoming someone who can be ruthlessly honest. Someone who can see clearly without needing to soften the truth into something more palatable. Someone who understands that their empathy was being used, sometimes deliberately, and they need to become a lot less available. This is why Jung's case is so terrifying. because it shows us that the path to wholeness for the empath often looks like a breakdown, and our world is very uncomfortable with people who break their patterns, especially women, especially those who have been cast in the role of caretaker, nurturer, healer. The woman in Jung's case eventually found her way to what he called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming fully yourself, not as a reflection of what others need you to be, but as the complete expression of your own psychological totality. For empaths, this journey is always terrifying, because individuation demands that you disappoint people, that you reject the roles that were assigned to you, that you become, temporarily or perhaps permanently, the person that others think is selfish. But here's what Jung knew. The empath who completes their individuation process doesn't become selfish. They become something far more dangerous to the systems that benefited from their self-erasure. They become free. Now, there's a third principle I want to introduce, and this is something Jung explored in his work on complexes. A complex is an emotionally toned idea that has taken on autonomous power in the psyche. For many empaths, there's a caretaking complex. It's not a choice. It's automatic. Someone is in pain, and before the thinking mind can engage, the empath has already leaned in, already absorbed, already made it their responsibility. This complex often has roots in childhood. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally fragile, and you learned early that your job was to manage their feelings. Maybe you had a sibling who suffered, and you made it your mission to ease their pain. Maybe you simply came into the world with a nervous system that's wired to attune and respond to others. Regardless of the origin, the result is the same. You became an antenna for the emotional weather of everyone around you. And an antenna that never gets a break will eventually burn out. Jung's case study showed something that's often overlooked in modern psychology. The breakdown of the empath isn't a personal failure. It's a systemic failure. It's a failure of everyone around them to reciprocate, to check in, to ask how they are without expecting the answer, "I'm fine," to see them instead of just using them. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people around the empath don't want them to break this pattern, because they've become dependent on it. They've built their sense of security on the foundation of this person's endless capacity to absorb and transform their pain. When the empath begins to set boundaries, when they begin to refuse, it feels like betrayal. And the empath, who has been trained since childhood to manage others' emotions, feels that this betrayal acutely. They feel guilty. They feel selfish. They feel like they're becoming a bad person. This is the moment where real transformation becomes possible, or where the empath retreats back into the comfortable prison of caretaking. I want you to think about something. In your own life, where are you absorbing pain that isn't yours to absorb? Where are you translating other people's emotional weather into tasks on your to-do list? Where are you saying yes when your whole being is screaming no? These aren't rhetorical questions. Jung believed that until you answer them honestly, until you feel the weight of them in your body, you can't actually begin to heal. The empath who breaks and then consciously chooses to integrate their darker aspects becomes something extraordinary. They become someone who can hold truth without diluting it for comfort, someone who can love fiercely without dissolving themselves, someone who can see others' pain without absorbing it into their own nervous system. This is the promise on the other side of the breakdown, not a return to the old self, but the emergence of a new self. A self that has walked through the fire and chosen to be whole rather than perfect, chosen to be real rather than useful. But getting there requires something most empaths have never practiced. It requires them to become, temporarily, the thing they fear most. It requires them to become cold, to become selfish, to become the person others accuse them of being during that breakdown phase, and to stay there long enough to understand that they don't have to apologize for existing. This is where the terror of Jung's case begins to make sense. The woman didn't just have a bad period. She became, for a time, nearly cruel, not because she wanted to hurt people, but because she was finally, after decades of suppression, letting her psyche tell the truth. The truth that she had been used, that her compassion had been taken for granted, that her boundaries had been violated daily, and the people around her couldn't handle that truth, so they labeled her, they pathologized her, they tried to get her back into the familiar role, because her wholeness threatened the systems that had been built on her fragmentation. But Jung followed this case long enough to document what happened next. The woman didn't destroy herself. She didn't apologize her way back into caretaking. She slowly, painfully, began to understand that the anger wasn't her problem. The anger was her guide. It was showing her where her boundaries had been violated, where her integrity had been compromised, where she had agreed to things she never should have agreed to. And as she listened to that anger instead of running from it, something remarkable happened. She began to change not the surface of herself but the architecture. She changed what she would accept, what she would tolerate, who she would give her time and energy to. And yes, she lost people. The ones who had benefited from her self-erasure were unwilling to adjust, but she also attracted new people, people who could see her, who didn't need her to be broken to feel okay about themselves. This is the outcome that doesn't get talked about enough. The empath who heals doesn't just become more balanced, they become more selective, more honest, more dangerous to systems of exploitation. Here's what I need you to understand about your own life. If you identify as an empath, your sensitivity is not your weakness, but the way you've been taught to use it might be. You've been trained to absorb, to translate, to manage, to transform your own nervous system into a regulatory system for other people. This is not love. This is not kindness. This is depletion wearing the mask of virtue. And if you're at the point where you're starting to snap, where your patience is thinning, where your capacity to care is drying up, that's not a sign that you're becoming a bad person. That's a sign that something in you is finally demanding to live. The question now becomes, will you let it? Will you allow yourself to break in a way that doesn't lead right back into the familiar patterns? Will you move through the anger, the coldness, the necessary selfishness that comes with real transformation? Will you do the harder work of integration instead of returning to the numbed state of endless caretaking? Because here's what Jung's case ultimately teaches us. The empath who breaks and then consciously chooses to understand that breaking, who integrates the light and dark, who finally establishes real boundaries not from a place of spite but from a place of self-respect, that person becomes whole. And a whole person is infinitely more valuable to the world than a fragmented person who is merely useful. Think about the relationships in your life right now. Are there people who only reach out when they need something? Are there moments when someone vents their entire emotional burden onto you without ever asking how you are? Are you the friend who listens but is never really heard? These patterns don't exist by accident. They exist because at some point, you showed someone that you could handle their emotional load, and they've never questioned whether you should have to. The empath who heals asks different questions. Not how can I help them feel better, but why is it my job to help them feel better? Not what do they need from me, but what do I need to survive this relationship? These questions feel selfish. They're not. They're the beginning of self-respect. Now, there's something else that Jung noticed in the cases of empaths who successfully integrated their shadow. They didn't lose their capacity for compassion. In fact, it became deeper and more real, because it was no longer mixed with self-erasure. It was no longer contaminated by unspoken resentment. It became a choice rather than a compulsion. This is the distinction between compassion and caretaking. Compassion sees another person and responds from wholeness. Caretaking sees another person and abandons itself. One is sustainable. The other will eventually implode. The empath who breaks is often the one whose system is finally rejecting the unsustainable pattern. Your nervous system is saying no before your mind catches up. Your body is shutting down before your guilt can override it. This is not pathology. This is wisdom. But the culture will call it many things: selfishness, coldness, betrayal, toxicity. These words will cut deeply because you've built your identity around being the opposite of all of them. You've spent years proving that you're not selfish, that you're warm, that you're loyal, that you're good. And now, in the middle of your breakdown, you're being told that you're proving all of your doubts about yourself true. But I'm here to tell you what Jung understood. You're not becoming selfish. You're becoming balanced. And the world will interpret balance as coldness because it has become accustomed to your depletion. Let me ask you this. In the relationships where you've started to withdraw, where you've become less responsive, less accommodating, less available, have you actually become less loving? Or have you simply stopped sacrificing yourself and still being expected to be grateful for the opportunity? Sit with that. Really sit with it. The empath who is breaking is often the one who is finally becoming honest. And honesty looks a lot like cruelty when it's directed at the systems that benefited from your deception. Not deception of others, but deception of yourself. The lie that you were fine. The lie that it didn't hurt. The lie that endless giving would eventually be reciprocated. This is the moment where real healing becomes possible, because you've finally stopped lying, and the truth is uncomfortable for everyone. Jung's case followed this woman for years after her breakdown, and what he documented was that she didn't return to her old self, but she also didn't stay in the cold, angry phase indefinitely. She integrated. She became someone who could hold both, someone who could care deeply while maintaining fierce boundaries, someone who could see people's pain without absorbing it, someone who could say no without guilt. And the people who stayed in her life were transformed by this, because they were forced to become more real too. They couldn't just dump their emotions and expect them to be taken care of. They had to participate in their own healing. They had to reciprocate. They had to see her. And those who couldn't do that, who still needed her to be broken to feel okay about themselves, they left. And she grieved that. But she also breathed easier. This is the outcome that looks selfish from the outside. But from the inside, it feels like the first time you can actually breathe in years. I want to be clear about something. What I'm describing is not avoidance. It's not becoming cold and staying there. It's not using boundaries as a weapon or an excuse to withdraw from everyone. That's not integration. That's just another form of fragmentation. True integration means you move through the anger and the coldness and the necessary self-focus, and you come out the other side capable of genuine connection. But now that connection is chosen. It's reciprocal. It's not powered by the unconscious need to prove your worth through endless sacrifice. Here's what I need you to really understand. If you're an empath, you've probably been told that your sensitivity is your superpower. And in a way, it is. But superpowers can become prisons if they're overused, if they're treated as obligations rather than gifts. The superpower of empathy is the ability to understand others deeply. But if that understanding is never reciprocated, if it's used to make you feel obligated to absorb their pain, then it becomes a liability. Jung spent his career documenting the ways that human potential becomes distorted by social expectations. And for empaths, the distortion is profound. You've learned that your worth comes from how much you can endure, that love means self-dissolution, that you should intuit other people's needs and meet them without being asked. These are not the values of empathy. These are the values of a person being used. And the day you snap, the day you can't do it anymore, that's not a failure of your empathy. That's the moment your psyche is refusing to cooperate with its own exploitation. This is what makes Jung's case so important, because it shows us that breaking is not the end of the story. It's a pivot point. It's the moment where you can either return to the old patterns or begin something genuinely new. The choice, terrifyingly, is yours. Now, think about this from a neurobiological perspective. When you're absorbing other people's emotions, your nervous system is in a state of constant activation. Your vagus nerve, which controls your parasympathetic response, is being hijacked by someone else's emotional state. You're not resting. You're not recovering. You're in a perpetual state of vigilance. This isn't sustainable. At some point, the nervous system shuts down. It becomes numb, or it becomes reactive. And both of these states feel like character flaws when really they're just signs that you've been asking your body to do something it was never designed to do indefinitely. The empath who breaks is often the one whose body finally says no. And your body is wiser than your mind. Your body knows when a situation is toxic. Your body knows when you're being used. Your body knows when you need to leave. But your mind, trained by years of caretaking and guilt, overrides those signals. Until one day the body just shuts down the override. That's the breaking point. That's the day the empath snaps. I want you to imagine something. Imagine that tomorrow you decided that your needs were just as valid as everyone else's. Not more important, just equally important. Imagine that you started prioritizing your own well-being with the same intensity that you've been prioritizing everyone else's. How would that feel? And more importantly, how would the people around you react? Most likely they would not celebrate your newfound balance. Most likely they would accuse you of being selfish, of being different, of changing. Because you have changed. And that change threatens the dynamic that they've become comfortable with. This is the real terror of the empath's breakdown. It's not the breakdown itself. It's the realization that happens afterward. The realization that the people you've been sacrificing for may not actually care whether you survive. I know that's harsh. I know it's uncomfortable. But Jung found that this realization, as painful as it is absolutely necessary for healing. Because you cannot heal a relationship that is fundamentally exploitative while still pretending that it's not exploitative. You have to see it clearly. You have to feel the full weight of it. And you have to make a conscious choice about whether that's a dynamic you're willing to continue. Many empaths, when faced with this choice during their breakdown, choose to continue. They apologize. They scale back their anger. They convince themselves that they were being unreasonable. And they return to caretaking, now with the added burden of knowing that the relationship is one-sided and choosing to continue anyway. But some empaths, the ones who stay with their breakdown long enough to understand it, choose differently. They choose to honor what their nervous system is telling them. They choose to walk away from relationships that are vampiric. They choose to surround themselves with people who are curious about their inner world, not just interested in what they can provide. And yes, this is lonely at first. The silence that comes when you stop being available is deafening. The absence of people who were only there for what you could give them is stark. But this loneliness is the price of becoming real. And on the other side of it, something different emerges. People who see you, real friends, reciprocal relationships, connections that don't require you to disappear. This is the promise that Jung held out, not that you'll feel better quickly, but that if you move through the breakdown consciously, if you integrate the shadow, if you establish real boundaries, then you can become whole. And wholeness is worth the temporary devastation of seeing clearly. Let me ask you something else. If you weren't an empath, if you didn't have this capacity to absorb and translate and manage other people's emotions, who would you be? What would you want? What would you create or build or pursue if you weren't constantly in service to someone else's emotional weather? This is the question that terrifies most empaths, because the answer requires you to know yourself in a way that you may never have been allowed to. Jung believed that this process of self-discovery, this radical honesty about who you are beneath all the roles and responsibilities, was the only path to what he called the self with a capital S. The self is not the ego. It's not the persona. It's the center of the entire psyche. And most people never meet it because they're too busy being who everyone else needs them to be. The empath who breaks has a chance to meet their self. Not because the breaking is good, but because the breaking forces you to stop performing. It forces you to stop managing. It forces you to be real. And if you can stay in that realness long enough, if you can integrate both the light and the shadow, the giver and the refuser, the compassionate and the boundary setting, then you can become someone who lives from that self. Someone who is not split, not fragmented, not constantly negotiating between what they want and what everyone else needs. That person is dangerous, not in a bad way. but in the way that wholeness is always dangerous to systems of control. This is why there are so many systems in place to keep empaths fragmented. Religion tells you that sacrifice is virtue. Culture tells you that women especially should prioritize others. Psychology has historically pathologized the empath rather than celebrated them. And the people around you, often unconsciously, reinforce the idea that your worth comes from how much you can endure. All of these systems benefit from your fragmentation. They all collapse if you actually become whole. So when you break, when you snap, when you finally reach the end of your capacity and you're no longer hiding it, you're not just having a personal crisis. You're challenging systems that have a lot invested in keeping you exactly as you are. This is the real terror of the empath's breakdown. And this is what Jung understood that so many therapists miss. You're not mentally ill. You're in a system that is ill and you're finally refusing to be the medication. I want you to sit with that for a moment. You're not the sick one. The system is. And when you stop medicating the system with your emotional labor, when you stop making yourself small to make everyone else comfortable, when you refuse to absorb pain that isn't yours, people will freak out. They will call it a breakdown. They will say you've changed. They will suggest that you need help. And maybe you do need help, but not the kind of help that gets you back to being useful. You need help understanding what's happening to you. Help integrating the shadow. Help establishing the boundaries that you should have had all along. Help becoming whole instead of helpful. The empath who completes this process, who moves all the way through their breakdown and comes out the other side, is someone the world desperately needs. Because they can see clearly. They can love fiercely without sacrificing themselves. They can help others without absorbing their pain. They can stand in their own power while remaining compassionate. But they cannot go back. Once you've seen the truth of how exploitative your relationships have been, once you've felt the anger of years of self-erasure, once you've experienced what it feels like to actually prioritize yourself, you cannot unknow that. You cannot unsee it. And that's okay. Because a life built on lies about your worth, on denying your needs, on endless caretaking, was never going to be sustainable anyway. The only question now is whether you'll use this breakdown as a doorway to something real, or whether you'll seal it back up and pretend that nothing changed. Jung followed cases for years. He documented not just the breakdown but what came after. And what he found was that the empaths who healed, who integrated, who chose wholeness over usefulness, they didn't become cold or selfish. They became more fully themselves. And that self, when it's fully expressed, is capable of a kind of love that is far deeper and more real than the love that comes from self-erasure. Because it's a choice. Every single time it's a choice, not an obligation, not a compulsion, not a desperate attempt to prove your worth, but a conscious decision to extend compassion because you want to, not because you have to. That's a completely different thing, and the world has trained you not to know the difference. So if you're breaking right now, if you're in the middle of the snap, if people are telling you that you've changed and not in a good way, I want you to know that you might be at the threshold of something extraordinary. You might be at the beginning of becoming real. It won't be easy. The anger will be intense. The guilt will be profound. The loneliness will feel unbearable at times. But on the other side of it, if you can move through it consciously, if you can honor what your psyche is trying to tell you, you can become whole. And wholeness is worth everything that you have to move through to get there. This is what Jung knew. And this is what his most terrifying case ultimately teaches us. The day the empath snaps is not the end of their story. It's the beginning of it. The beginning of becoming real. The beginning of integration. The beginning of wholeness. And while I know that's hard to believe when you're in the middle of the breaking, I promise you it's true. If this resonated with you, if you felt something shift while listening, I encourage you to share this with someone else. Not because it will go viral, but because someone in your life needs to hear this. Someone in your life is breaking right now, and they need to know that what's happening isn't a failure. It's a doorway. Share this with them. Let them know that they're not crazy, that their anger is valid, that their need for boundaries is not selfish, that wholeness is possible on the other side of the breakdown. And if you're not the one breaking but you know empaths who are, listen to them differently. Stop trying to get them back to where they were. Stop calling them selfish when they're finally protecting themselves. Stop expecting them to absorb your emotions just because they're good at it. Let them become whole. The world needs whole people more than it needs people who are broken in a way that makes everyone else comfortable. Jung's final insight, the one he returned to again and again in his work with empaths in crisis, was this: the self is already complete. It's already whole. You're not trying to become something you're not. You're trying to remember something you forgot. The real you. The one that exists beneath all the roles and responsibilities. The one that knows what it wants. The one that knows what it will and will not tolerate. That person has always been there. They've just been buried under years of caretaking and guilt, and the desperate need to prove their worth through endless sacrifice. The breakdown is the moment when that buried person starts clawing their way back up. And yes, it's ugly. And yes, it's terrifying. And yes, everyone around you will wish that you would just stay buried. But you can't. Once you've felt that stirring, once you've tasted what it might feel like to actually exist for yourself, you cannot unknow it. You cannot unsee it. And honestly, you shouldn't want to. So I invite you to stay present with this, to not apologize your way out of it too quickly, to let yourself feel the full weight of what's happening, to trust that your psyche knows what it needs even if your mind is terrified. And if you can do that, if you can move through this breakdown consciously, then you have the chance to become something that the world desperately needs. A whole person, a real person, an empath with boundaries, a giver who also knows how to receive, a person who loves fiercely without disappearing. That person is waiting for you on the other side of the breaking. And they are worth every difficult moment that it takes to get there.